afternoon, or good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. Solix Technologies is very excited to bring you this webinar, Data Management Challenges for Government Applications. Today we have two distinguished guest speakers for this webinar, and our first distinguished guest speaker is Mr. P.K. Agarwal, who is currently the CEO of the Indus Entrepreneurs, or TIE.org, TIE.org. Mr. P.K. Agarwal is the former Chief Technology Officer of State of California, and as a CTO of State of California, he has successfully consolidated multiple independent IT organizations, saving taxpayers over $60 million. And Mr. P.K. Agarwal also has the unique distinction of having a U.S. National Annual Award named as the P.K. Agarwal Award for Leadership in Electronic Government. We are very excited to have P.K. here and looking forward to hear the data management insights from him. We will also have Russ Holmes, who is the Senior Vice President of Enterprise Applications from DLT Solutions. And DLT Solutions is a leading provider of value-added solutions for government organizations. Russ brings with him extensive background of working with several government customers, and he is intimately familiar with the processes and challenges faced by the government organization. Very excited to have Russ also for this webinar. And the agenda for this particular webinar is primarily to look at the data management challenges faced by government organizations today. And Mr. PK and Russ will sort of give us more insight or in-depth insight into the processes and what is happening, what has happened. And we'll talk in detail about the data growth, data usage, how regulations are impacting the data, and the challenges faced by the government organization. And at the end of the session, we will also have a couple of case studies where we can actually see how the technologies help to address some of these challenges and so forth. And at the end of the session, we'll also have a quick Q&A session, and you are also encouraged to post questions on the chat window, and we'll actually consolidate the questions at the end of the session, and we'll have PK address some of these questions depending on the availability of the time. So we'll get started here, and at this point of time, I'll pass it to Russ to give us some brief background on the data growth and so forth. Russ, you on the line?
I am. Thank you very much. And okay, so just diving right in here, we are across the board seeing tremendous data growth in structured and unstructured data. The structured data is coming from different business processes that have been created to streamline operations or modernize infrastructure, such as data captured through RFID. And in case of government agencies, lots of data is collected when we file certain applications like vehicle registrations, new passports, etc. The same is true for unstructured content, where we are talking about documents or other types of content. One of the key things in modern applications is the ability to relate structured data and unstructured content. For example, when a new PO gets entered, the application can also capture the PO document or invoice in a scanned form and attach it to the transaction. Or the contract document gets attached to transactions related to the contract. All of this obviously is creating lots more demand on data storage. So, in the next slide, you can see the data growth graph from IDC in 2007. As you can see, in year 2011, the forecast is 10 times that of the year 2010.
Thank you, Raghu, and my greetings and good day, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Let me just provide sort of a couple of lighthearted perspectives on this thing before we get into the deep into the issue of data management. I recently saw a kind of a very fun cartoon from the New Yorker that the two guys are talking in the office, and the first guy said, I'm not backing up my data because I know our national security agencies are taking care of that. And I thought that's pretty hilarious. But it's an indication of some of the kind of issues that we want to really debate. The other thing that if you are in my age group and if the name Frank Zappa means anything to you, then he has a very famous song going back to 78, 79, which basically deals with what I call the DIKW hierarchy, which is data which leads to information, information that leads to knowledge, and knowledge that leads to wisdom, and wisdom that leads to love. And that's sort of the summary of Frank Zappa's song. It's also on YouTube, so look it up. It's just kind of, but it does make a point that somehow in our world today, where we are living in the age of technology, where data is growing and rapidly, we sort of make perhaps a subliminal assumption that the more data we have, somehow it makes us smarter. And I think you would all agree that that's definitely not the case. Certainly, in fact, if anything, probably having a lot of data adds to the clutter and maybe makes us less smart. Anyway, I'll leave that to your judgment, but I wanted to kind of just in a philosophical plane talk about the data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy. My belief is that the wisdom is sort of fixed in a society at any given point in time. Anyway, just to also give you a sort of historic perspective, back in 1985, I acquired my first IBM XT. The PC was the one without the hard drive, and XT was in the hard drive. And that 10 megabyte hard drive, in 1985, so that's about 25 years ago, cost me about $500. So $50 a megabyte. And now we are at a stage where, flash drives, you can get $1 a gigabyte for a flash drive, and if you're buying a hard drive, it's, in the range of 10 to 15 cents a gigabyte. So you can see that probably one thing that caused this massive data explosion is this sort of Moore's law of storage, if there's such a thing. So that's another point I wanted to just kind of get across. Another interesting data point is that at this point, we have very, very rapidly moved away from paper. 99.9% of information today is born digital and is retired digitally. So paper, as you can see in the grand scheme, has become very, very insignificant, and I think it's just a matter of a few more years where it kind of pretty much disappears off the scale. Another thing that's happening in the grand scheme is that sometimes for the right reasons, mostly for the wrong reasons, data itself tends to replicate. Probably the most prolific and simplest example is that let's say that I was to take a 2 megabyte PowerPoint presentation, something akin to what we're using for discussion today, and we were to mail to hypothetically 120 participants. That 2 megabyte file would occupy total net storage of 2 gigabytes. In fact, even before it leaves Solix offices, it will be replicated 7 times on a desktop, on a server, backup copy, and you kind of get the general idea. So you can see that not all of the growth of data is necessarily good, but the fact is that, so I think sometimes we ought to say, maybe the data is not growing, maybe it's the storage that's growing. Because maybe the data is growing, certainly, but not necessarily at the same sort of a pace. And so the last thing I want to kind of also point out that both this is true for structured and unstructured data, that in some ways, if we were to look back into the 21st century and look at our times today, we'll probably call this as the digital dark ages. And I'll quote Terry Cooney of the National Library of Canada, who just in a very simple couple of sentences, he put it into perspective. And I quote him, "As we move into the electronic era of digital objects, it is important to know that there are new barbarians at the gate, and that we are moving into an era of much of what we know today, much of what is coded and written electronically will be lost forever. We are too, in my mind, living in the midst of the digital dark ages." And I think it really kind of struck me as something very interesting. many of us can today read, our old, 5.25 inch or 8-inch floppy drives or the diskettes? And so it's this example of, on one hand, we feel very tech savvy and sophisticated, but in a long view, with centuries there, we feel like we really haven't really evolved enough to be able to say that we are trying to sort out in a society and in our organization or corporations what's important, and are we handling it in a manner that's going to be available for generations to come. But anyway, that's just sort of a broad brush philosophical perspective. But in regards to public sector, data is growing pretty much across the board in all aspects of it, and we'll delve a little bit deeper into it in a few moments. Same with corporation, but generally I would say it's in the order of 40 to 60% a year, which is a pretty significant growth. And so I think our collective challenge is that how do we make sense out of all this? Not only sense from a cost standpoint, how do we make sense out from the managing complexity? How do we manage this from a standpoint of having the right answers to the right questions? So that's sort of a broad brush perspective on the data growth and a little bit of history around this thing. Back to you, Russ.
Okay, thanks, PK. So clearly we're seeing reports of data growth across the board in all organizations. It really is breathtaking. Based on your experience, such as your role as the CTO of California, can you provide some insight on this for government agencies?
Yeah, so if you look at specifically to government agencies, let me sort of peel this a little bit, the 60%, 50-60% annual growth in data storage. So let's take a look at what's today known as electronic benefits transfer, used to be known as food stamps program. So, we were very methodical at one point when we developed these systems, and we used to sort of even get down to and say, gee, how many bytes can we use for capturing a transaction? And 128 bytes was a very good number because that corresponded to a segment on a disk drive, so we could even have an I/O at a very high speed. So even a typical beneficiary of food stamps or electronic benefits could, once a month, we captured the transaction, and that was it. And pretty much everything else was pretty much falling in the paper in the commercial sector. Now we have point-of-sale terminals. There's no paper food stamps, and so somebody who has the misfortune of having to rely upon food stamps or electronic benefits, they have a card, and they go to a supermarket. And so now every transaction, or within that transaction, every purchase is now being recorded. So you can see that what at one point was a 128 bytes a month type transaction has now multiplied astronomically into all sort of things. Another example I like to use is that in public sector, we inventory a lot of stuff. And as you know, these RFID chips are making their inroads, and barcodes and everything else. And used to be, if you take a typical, let's just take a fire department or somebody like a transportation department or a highway patrol, where you have lots and lots of physical objects, including cars and trucks and bulldozers and so on and so forth. So the classic thing was you sort of pretty much had a record of each item, and you would pretty much say, okay, we bought it in such date, and it's operational or not, and so on and so forth. But now we reached a point where we have barcodes or we have RFID scanners. So we are not only keeping track of do we have it or not, where has it been, how many miles has it been driven, what was each trip like. And so again, you can see that how this kind of a very structured data continues to grow. Now, obviously, this issue is not only of volume, the issue becomes that of quality as well. And I think that the quality issues start to come up because when you start to have replication of data, structured or unstructured, multiple sources, how do you ensure quality? And I think this issue, let me give you an example of a typical state government. A typical state government, and I'm sure you can guess, but there's probably 20 to 25 different places. We capture address data of each individuals. So two obvious ones would be that if you own a car, which as most everybody on this call does, and you pay probably taxes for your, some shape or form. So you can see that two places you have records, and some for statutory reasons, some otherwise. You're going to have different records, but again, from a customer-centric point of view, it's much more critical that they would rather say, what, if I'm moving, and at least in a state like California, highly urbanized, 25% of the people move every year. Wouldn't it be wonderful that if we did one address change can see that why this data is taking the dimension, of the 50 or 60% annualized growth. And I really truly believe that I think deduplication is going to be part of the answer, because if we don't deal with that question, this will continue to grow and just, become one enormous challenge, and probably in the end, sort of what I call make us stupid, instead of smarter. Raj, you do?
Yep, thanks, PK. All right, so on another subject, we've been hearing a lot about regulations such as Data Accountability and Trust Act. We all heard of OMB Circular A110. Can you give us some insight into the impact of regulations on data and applications in government agencies?
Okay. Yeah, so regulations are obviously coming around. Used to be that everything on paper, and up until I would say 2004, 2005, pretty much electronic records were considered off limits when it came to regulations. There are two things that are driving this. In 2006, there was a federal law that basically said that electronic records, structured or unstructured, or email, or data sources, they're in the case of litigation, they're discoverable, otherwise known as e-discovery. So that was sort of the first foray into this thing. And about the same time, California was a pioneer in this thing. And as we were starting to see privacy breaches were more and more significant, California passed a law that basically said that in case there's a accidental or not so a breach of privacy of an individual, that is subject to certain regulations, and there are certain obligations that the person who's holding the data. And this has completely changed the landscape. And if I'm slow to get all the people on the call here, but you'll see that as we talk about the solutions, you can see that why, if for no other reason, for these kind of reasons, you really have to get a good handle on where your data is. So e-discovery changed the whole thing from a standpoint of what we store, what's our duration, how we archive stuff, because, a part of it is that perhaps some things you don't want to archive forever, because otherwise, but again, if you don't have control over your data, how do you even know what copies exist? So that e-discovery sort of became a big issue. And then privacy, let me just put a little plug that if you want to see a very good guide on best practices, if you were to go to a California website, www.privacy.ca.gov, you'll see privacy best practices. On the privacy front, I don't have a lot of time, but let me share with you a number that's startling. When you think, the question really becomes, is that, okay, so everything has a cost. So in case you have a privacy breach, just try to pick a number, we don't have the kind of interactivity, and so just because I'll give you a number that might startle you a little bit, that what would be the cost? When I say cost, being direct cost, indirect cost, opportunity cost, lost opportunity cost of a privacy breach per record. So the number is approximately $200,000 per record. Just imagine, $200,000 per record. So think of it this way, that if you have 100,000 records breach, you can do the math and you can see that we're talking about millions of dollars here. And the reason for that is that, well, let's just look at the direct costs. The direct costs come into play simply the fact that first is the notification requirement. You have to notify everybody, which means, starting with the cost of stamp, production of a letter, all the lawyers have to be, word the letter correctly. Following that, it's pretty much a standard practice that you set up a call center, because letters not enough. People are going to want to talk to somebody. So you got to pretty much in a hurry set up a call center and get that scripted. It's also becoming a standard practice that in these kind of situations, depending if a financial breach, then you offer people a service, which is essentially credit monitoring. So in case something goes wrong, you're not liable for it. At least you're saying that we're giving you tools to monitor it, so in case something doesn't. And these are just some of the simplest direct costs. There's plenty of indirect costs in the organization. The PR-related costs that you have to incur in order to deal with this thing. Certainly the lawsuits. And then finally, the opportunity cost, because it tarnishes the brand. So $200 a record, I mean, that alone itself, when you start to look at various options for data management solutions, you see that why there is investment, just if nothing, no other reason, just as insurance policy against that kind of a damage. And so what's happening in the aftermath of all this, e-discovery is pretty much accepted fact. And then more and more states were starting to deal with legislation that deals with the breach of privacy and the consequences and actions required. And more recently, federal government has kind of got into the thing and saying maybe we should have national standards as to each state trying to come up with different standards because it makes life very difficult. So that's sort of in a nutshell what's happening in the business of regulations. And this is going to become a global issue because the challenges of how quickly data multiplies and how much information can spread and some sense of respect for the individual is going to become a global phenomenon. Back to you, Russ.
Okay, thanks, PK. And very painful stuff, and sounds like the dollars are just the tip of the iceberg there. So we've talked about data growth, usage, and capture of data, the impact of regulations. So what challenges are you seeing government agencies facing with all this data growth?
Yeah, so, challenges really obviously always kind of break down into two areas. The cost challenge and the complexity challenge. The cost challenge is pretty straightforward. It's that, despite we get I refer some numbers that we're getting down to where you can buy a hard drive, at 10, 15 cents a gigabyte. So it kind of makes us a little bit casual. To say, well, storage, is cheap. And, the fact that you can be on Google, app, or you get your free email account from one of the big portals. And, you get 5, 10 gigabytes of storage for free. And you sort of say, well, it's really, there's no cost to it. But that may be true in a consumer domain to some extent. But when you look at the enterprise domain, it's really, really not so. So you have the people cost, you have the infrastructure cost, you have the maintenance cost, and when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about not just the hardware, but enterprise licenses, for storage software and all that are getting very expensive. And when you account for all this stuff, we realize that no matter which way you slice it, no matter how efficient you are, your enterprise storage is going to end up costing you somewhere in the order of $5 to $10 a gigabyte, and that's a pretty significant cost you have to deal with. Now, even if you were to afford that cost, there's yet another opportunity issue. Now, we all know that roughly 80% plus of all of our resources go into lights on, into maintenance. So I think if there's even a more compelling reason that we have to bring this cost, the people side of this cost under control, is the cost of resources, because if you don't free up more and more of your resources for new development, for new ventures, upgrading your applications and those kind of things, then you run the risk of really becoming a legacy organization. So that's, I think, to me, even more of just a direct cost issue, is that 80% of resources go lights on, and most progressive companies at this point are saying, you know what, we're going to find a way to flip that equation. We're going to make sure that no more than 25-30% of resources are going into maintenance, and then more and more of going into really kind of looking for technology becoming a much more of a strategic asset. On the other side, the issue of complexity. Now, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but the fact that you start to get, in a structured data sense, a lot of different data sources or different view of the same data in different places, you run into the challenge of synchronization. And so not only there's a tracking issue, but synchronization is a messy one, because you start to get a different answer to the same question depending on which data source you go to. IT starts to lose trust, because people start to say, gee, how come I go to data source A and I get a different answer, and data source B has a different answer? So it becomes a trust issue for IT, and that's the kind of stuff it takes a long time to sort out once you lose that. So anyway, that's the challenges I see really pretty much in the two areas. Cost issue, which also translates into lights on and how much of resources are going to lights on, and the issue of complexity and trust. Rush?
Thank you, PK. Now, can you briefly talk about some of the new initiatives that you're seeing government agencies are embarking upon involving data storage?
Yes, thank you, Russ. The new initiatives, the one obvious and the simplest new initiative, it has to do with the fact that we just sort of take a brute force approach to this thing. And we simply say, let's just throw more capacity. Let's just buy more storage and just kind of throw it at it. So that's one approach. Like I said, I don't recommend it, but that seems to be the expedient answer. The second is that sometimes because certain applications require certain storage configurations, to be much more effective. Consolidation of storage, certainly that's we are seeing everybody saying, well, partly for security reasons, otherwise, we consolidate a lot of the storage, and again, we don't need as much excess storage that way. Application modernization, that certainly is in the way of kind of getting a handle on storage. Storage as a service, I talk to a lot of people. We are all exploring this thing to see if we can leverage sort of the idea of eventually some sort of future where there are big storage farms which bring the price down. Kind of learning from Yahoos and the Googles of the world that as to how you bring your storage costs down. So that's another way. People are starting to explore this thing. The idea of a tier storage. So you buy different kind of storage for different needs. For certain bread and butter mainframe applications, you have some very, very high performance, very expensive storage, maybe even get to flash. And then on the other hand, for certain type of application or certain type of databases, you get down to very, very archival level storage. So that's kind of coming into play. This is where, the virtual tape is, helping a lot. And certainly this is where, as you get into the case studies, you'll see that there's probably some very good answers out there that typically aren't being, they're just catching on finally with people. And I'll let Solix people talk about that. But all of the things that I see out there are certainly very tactical approaches to solving the problem, but it's not really getting to the root cause. And like I said, we'll save that for the case studies. And the reason that this further perpetuates itself is that because within the IT we have these silos. We have and the two silos that are relevant here is that we have the application developers, maintenance people, and they typically really don't care about infrastructure. I mean, they're used to make sure the applications are elegant and they run well and they're fast and so on and so forth. And so they look at data from that standpoint. On the other hand, you have data center people. And they look at simply from a standpoint, they look at the growth curve and say, well, this is growing, so therefore we need it. So, and I don't want to overplay it. There's certainly architects who are looking at all these kind of things, but in general, these silos don't really have a tightly integrated strategy. So you can see that what happens is that in the end, a lot of it's not a carefully thought out. We become very tactical, and as a result, data continues to grow. So that's sort of a quick upshot of the kind of solutions we are seeing, which tend to be more tactical in nature and not strategic. To you, Russ.
Okay, great. Thanks, PK. So another thing we've been hearing a lot about is green IT initiatives. For example, Green California, which you may be familiar with. Can you talk about the impact of data growth on green and why it is important to manage data growth efficiently?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, to me, there's a pretty simple answer to this. In the world we are living in, and if you follow what's happening in the Gulf and everything else, I think energy efficiency and how we deal with it, and this is playing 100 different ways, the smart grids and so on and so forth, it's becoming a moral imperative. So I think everything we do, including dealing with storage issues, we have to think green. So even if we can afford it, even if we can, manage it effectively, still to me the fact is that these are electromechanical devices or sometimes purely electronic devices, and the less we use of these, and the better off we are. So that just at the outset, I just want to sort of offer that point of view. That it's a moral imperative and it's a mandate that we have to deal with it. Another thing I want to point out is that thanks to, on a good side, thanks to reduction in computing costs and storage costs, we have pretty much moved away from paper. In fact, paper, as it turns out, that is even a bigger security risk. We had a number of events that made me realize this in the state of California, that anytime you have paper, and data centers still print a lot of stuff, and still a certain number of people would rather have things on paper, is that the paper inherently is so much less secure. But it goes through so many hands. I mean, think about a typical paper cycle. Think of your company sending out a notification that has some confidential data or a bill to a customer on paper. I mean, you can't even imagine the number of handles it goes through, including we had events where things fell off a truck, and next thing we have a breach of privacy. So I think in some ways, thanks to technology, we have moved away from paper, which itself creates a certain amount of energy efficiency. But notwithstanding that, let me say this, that when it comes to energy use and the growth of energy use, data center is the fastest segment of growth of energy use in the overall energy picture. minimizing energy use or increasing energy efficiency within data centers. And so I think another very, very critical argument for doing effective Java storage management and getting things under control. Okay, rest to you.
Thanks very much, PK. Now I'd like to turn to Raghu. So we've heard from PK about the problems around data growth and some of the challenges faced by government agencies. Can you detail for us some case studies on how these challenges have been addressed by some government organizations and what the benefits from more efficient data management can be?
Thanks, Russ, and also wanted to thank PK for his very detailed insight and giving us specific examples on how things are, what has been happening and what is the current state and what are the challenges. I think I want to kind of take one of the things which PK just mentioned, on the initiative side, tactical versus strategic. I mean, obviously, I think for as the data keeps growing, I mean, the tactical things are that, yeah, we can add more servers, we can add more storage, and so forth. But I think the bigger question is, well, I mean, how do we effectively manage that in a more strategic fashion? And I think that's where the sort of the technology we provide from the Solix technology sort of comes in to effectively manage the challenges which PK sort of mentioned, that either in the government sector or in the commercial as well. And I think the whole crux of it is, well, the data is growing, but now how do we effectively manage that? And in some sense, like where you can actually take the data through a life cycle policy process as the data keeps aging, you sort of move it up to the lower tier storages, and of course eventually when the data is no longer required, then you are essentially purging it and so forth. And one of the other things which PK also mentioned and I want to touch upon is the application modernization, and he talked about the sort of the lights on fact for just to keep the things coming in the data centers and so forth. So in number of cases from the research, it's almost you can take it for sort of a guarantee that 10% of your applications that you're running on in your IT infrastructure or data centers are probably no longer useful or never been used. So, but the key thing is, well, we still need to hang on to the data. So how do you sort of retire those legacy applications or modernize the infrastructure and do that? So in that context, I wanted to talk about two specific case studies, and one about the Social Security Administration or SSA. And SSA is using Oracle Government Financial Applications for last few years, and these are one of the mission critical applications that SSA uses to capture the financial transactions and so forth, and a lot of reporting gets done. And some of the key things about these SSA financial applications was SSA was finding it very difficult to sort of provision enough storage capacity for these applications. And as you see for these applications, it's just not the storage required for the production application, because the application as it sort of ages and new upgrades come in, new versions come in, so you need to patch it, you need to test it and so forth. So you need to create a number of copies of your production application, and SSA was having a very difficult time just trying to provision the storage required, and also the time it actually takes to do that, and of course the testing has to go through, the upgrade has to happen, and they are facing these performance issues, storage issues, and so forth. And obviously, SSA being the government, they had strict policies on how long the data needs to be kept. For example, they had to keep the 6 years data online, and after that, for the data privacy issues, anything over 6 years has to be moved to a specific archive and so forth. And this is where what we have done is we have worked very closely with DLT Solutions and Security Administration, so sort of bring the ILM technology or the archiving technology where we implemented that on the Oracle Financials. And essentially, the first phase, we sort of tackled the issue of data subsetting, where SSA was trying to make at least about 15 to 20 clones copies for the testing purposes, and they're trying to reduce the storage cost and provisioning of the storage, and that's what we have sort of addressed in the first phase. And in the second phase, we have sort of implemented the archiving technology, where based on the government policies and the policies that are dictated on how long which transactions have to be kept online, then the rest are essentially sort of archived in an archive database, and which also means that you are essentially reducing the footprint for your production application, improving the performance of it, reducing the storage cost, and also addressing one other issue, which is business continuity in case of a disaster recovery occurs. How fast can you recover the systems and so forth? And at this point of time, SSA has sort of benefited big time from these more strategic data management implementations, where they have reduced the storage cost, the time it actually takes to do subsetting and cloning, and also sort of sticking with the policies and data security and privacies and how long the data can be kept online, and also improving the business processes whereby the performance standards are maintained for particular applications. That is specific on social security administration, where the information lifecycle management and technology and the data subsetting technology has helped SSA to address some of these data management challenges. In the second case study, I wanted to touch on one of the key things that was mentioned by PK, which is the regulations, and he talked about the Data Privacy Act and the opportunity cost and the things you have to go through when a data breach actually occurs, from informing the people to setting up the call centers and whatnot. And that is exactly one of the key things Solix Technologies also provide, which is the data masking technology. So that most of the time the data is secure when it is in the production applications, but the point to be noted is very often the production databases are make copies in non-production environments. So at least on average, 6 to 8 copies are made. And when you make these copies, one of the key things that happens is you are essentially moving the production data, which means all the sensitive and confidential information. For example, social security numbers, credit card numbers, customer data is essentially in the non-production environments, which is far less secure than the production systems. So in the case of state of Ohio, they're big users of Oracle PeopleSoft Financials, Human Capital Management, Enterprise Performance Management, and so forth. And obviously, there are a lot of sensitive data and confidential data that is actually stored in these applications. And the key thing in state of Ohio is like these operations, these IT operations are also outsourced. That means you need to take far more action that the data that you are actually providing to the outsourced party does not have any sensitive or confidential information. And of course, there are all these mandates that they have to go through. So, and that was the biggest thing on how to actually sort of reduce the risk and be compliant in the Data Privacy Act and so forth. And that's where we Solix Technologies has come in, and where we have sort of implemented our Solix EDMS, the data masking solution, where essentially what we have done is we have automated the data loading process and optimized the data masking process. So as and when the production data is moved into the non-production environments, essentially all the sensitive information is actually unmasked or encrypted or decrypted. And this, the data we are talking about is literally very large. For each of these application modules, we were talking about 3,000 data elements or columns for each application. So several thousand columns and obviously millions of transactions. data that is relevant that still makes sense for testing, but that's not that doesn't make sense from the data privacy point of view. So that's where Solix technologies also sort of comes in and plays into that data masking aspect to sort of help protecting the data and also reducing the risk from the data management point of view. So I want to take a couple of more minutes jumping off the case studies and again I want to go back to the point I think which PK mentioned about the cost that actually is used for maintenance of the IT infrastructure or the data growth or the application itself, which could be like 70 or 80% of your IT budget and so forth. So, and I think one of the key things PK also mentioned is, well, if you're spending all that money, so then what are you going to spend when you want to improve the process and innovate and move forward? So in that context, I want to talk about the return on investment, and this is actually a real case study. Of course, we haven't put the name of the customer here, and what this slide shows is the customer has about 550 applications, and as I said, almost on average, about 10% of these applications could be essentially retired or decommissioned. But the key thing is you still need to keep the data. So just for the case of holding the data, a lot of organizations, including government agencies, just maintain these applications. And when we sort of analyze the applications and so forth and did the ROI analysis, we realized that the average savings for applications could be up to $19,000, but of course depends on the type of the application and so forth, and it could be less or even up to $40,000 per applications. And the data size was about 12 terabytes. So, and once the application modernization or the application retirement process has been done, and essentially we saw like a 9% reduction in the application fee. And again, talking about one of the key things PK mentioned, the data redundancy and the data synchronization, you ended up keeping only one copy of the data for each of these applications, and of course reducing the maintenance, license, and upgrades. So I wanted to point out one key number in this case study, and the other things I think you can read on the slide. But the payback period for this particular project or for this customer is 4.6 months. So essentially the investment they have to do and the return on investment or the payback period is essentially 4.6 months. That is less than a year, where typically most of the organizations do budgeting for 1 year and so forth. And I want to kind of at this point ask PK sort of his take on this sort of a ROI model where we are talking about the payback period of 5 months or so, and what does that mean in the government perspective, government agencies perspective?
Thank you, Raghu. I think this is a very important point. When I looked at the offering, Solix offering, and the power it brings, my first reaction always is that governments, it's a fact of life. I think for now and for the next year or two, there just isn't a lot of new money to be had. And in some ways, it's a very difficult statement to make, but really we don't have money to innovate, we don't have money to transform. So naturally, the question always in my prior role until a couple of months ago was always the question that how can we redirect what we have? And I think this is a perfect candidate that while it's a strategic solution to a very vexing problem, but at the same time, the way I look at it is that because it can be the ROI is so short, you can pretty much do something midstream. So let's say interesting enough, we are in the month of July, and so for most governments, it's the beginning of the fiscal year, state and locals, most of them, and for federal government is coming up in October very, very shortly. So in essence, if you can accomplish the ROI, especially if you start early in the fiscal year, you can take the existing monies that may be intended to be spent in storage or data management in the second or third or fourth quarters, and you can say, okay, we're going to put it into some innovative solution, because by the time we get to that point, those costs would disappear. So I think that's one thing I found is a very innovative way of taking your spending streams and there's a reasonable assurance that can pay off within the same fiscal year. You accomplish a transformational exercise without having to go through the normal process, which, as you know, sometimes can take 12 to 18 months. And so you don't have to wait. So I think that was my kind of, I felt really good about that. Well, it's a strategic offering, but the ROI is so quick because the process is so streamlined that you can actually make it happen without having to go beg for new money, which is often the case. So that's sort of my take on this thing.
Thank you, PK. And I think that's a very good insight on how the budgeting process sort of works and how we can actually embark on these projects without having to think about in a very long term, even though it's a strategic initiative. But at this point of time, I think we have a few minutes to get on the top of the hour. So I'd like to open up the session for any question and answers from the attendees. You can also post your question on the chat line at this point, or you can ask the question. You'll have to unmute because I think most of you did *6 to mute. So
if you do ask question over the conference line,